Welcome to the Science of Beers podcast with me, Mick McGee. I love having proper conversations with intelligent people, especially over beer, and that's exactly what this podcast is. We'll cover a new topic each week and get to know the scientific process. Join us with a beer and let's cheers to science. This week I have the pleasure of joining Thomas Burø for a virtual beer. Thomas is in Copenhagen and I am in Ireland. Thomas is a philosopher, a teacher, a musician. He's arranged a bunch of cultural events and festivals. Here we go. First of all, Thomas, you're doing a PhD at the Copenhagen Business School.
Yeah,
is that right?
That's true.
And one thing that I'm aware of, whenever you're not doing that PhD, you're also the frontman in a punk band.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I sing in Tvivler, which is a really strange name to pronounce in English.
Tvivler.
Yeah, Tvivler. Yeah.
Okay. What does it mean?
It's as a noun. It's the word you use for someone who's doubting or someone who's in doubt. A Tvivler is a person who doubts.
Okay.
And yeah, that's basically it. It can also just be a more processual thing, but
doubting in the sense where they're always skeptical, or doubting in the more positive sense of science and questioning things.
I mean, I guess that depends on the temper, but I think we took it much more as a sort of almost like an existential kind of doubt, like when we're not really certain about anything. So it's not just about questioning; it's also about not really having this foothold in life, not being absolutely sure of who you are or where you're going, and not really having these things fleshed out. So it's more of a sort of deep founded uncertainty.
I know that the album that's coming out is called Ego, so I think those two names go very well together. You know, the ego can be very much in doubt of itself, whether the ego is aware of it or not.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I also think that just picking up on that line, I think it's one of the things that we wanted to emphasize with that title of the album is sometimes the ego is also a way of, I guess, assuaging for some of the anxiety of uncertainty. So you can build all these walls of certainty and pretend to be sort of in the know and I guess like come off as like really self-confident, but while deep down you're still like, shit, what's going on? Having that sort of sense of being lost, basically.
Yeah, the more I experience, the more I think that's totally true. We're all just making it up as we go along.
Yeah, sort of paving while we go. Yeah.
It's 3:00 in Ireland, where I'm calling from. I don't know whether you're on the beer yet or not. You are? Okay. Well,
I am.
I'm going to crack open a tin of Guinness here.
I'm going for it's a India Pale Ale.
But I see it's a Danish brand, so there you go. We have Denmark and Ireland coming together through beers. Cheers.
Cheers.
So I'm super curious to hear about the PhD then, Thomas.
Sure. I think it's always tricky to figure out where to start. So I thought I'd start by spelling out my ways into it to begin with. I have a master's degree in philosophy, so I'm interested in ideas and concepts. So that's one way of approaching what I'm studying, which is ecology of culture. Second, I am at a department called Department of Organization. So what we do there is study organized phenomena in all kinds of ways. So We have people working with taxation, tax evasion, and people working with the oil industry and marine industries, and people working with dirty jobs and the military. So all kinds of organized phenomenon. So I'm looking at culture as an organized phenomenon, and specifically looking at it in terms of what I call ecological organization, or thinking about a regional cultural life as an organized phenomenon across various organizations. I can give you some examples in a few. And then the final, or the third way into it is by my background as a musician, as a practicing artist, and also I did a lot of cultural organizing. So I put on festivals and theatrical performances and all kinds of events, and worked with that for 10 years before starting the PhD. So I sort of also had that practical experience with me. So a combination of practical experience and conceptual interest in culture and how to think about culture. And then sort of mediated by the idea of organization. So that's the framework. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at, or maybe that's interesting, we have a map. So I'm looking at this region here.
So we're looking at a map here of Zealand, the island that holds Copenhagen, and you're looking at north, center, Zealand.
Yeah, northwestern part of Zealand. That's a region called Ooops in Danish, which is actually called the Shire, if you translate it.
Perfect.
Almost. And it's a province that has always been rural or provincial. And I'm looking at that region. It's 33,000 people living there.
So
are you from,
by summer, are you from that area?
I'm just south of the region. Yeah. Like I can't really claim to be a local in that sense, but I'm just south of it. So I know it, and it's an interesting region because by summer you have a lot of people there for the second homes. The population grows by 100,000 people during summer.
Maybe not this summer, unfortunately, but
no. And so I'm looking at this region in terms of how is culture organized, and how is culture organized as you could call it a macroscopic or maybe like what I call an ecological system. And by calling it a system, you also think about it in terms of differentiation. So you have a theater that produces theatrical offerings. You have a library that's in the business of literature, and you have a museum that's in the business of cultural heritage and visual arts and so on and so forth. So all the recognized art forms and newer art forms, they exist side by side and organized. Most of them are publicly funded organizations. Mm-hmm. So there are various ways in which these organizations are working in agreement with the municipality, often regulated by some law, like the law of theater or the law of libraries and so on and so forth. And then besides the public cultural institutions and self-governing organizations, you also have the commercial organizations that produce cultural offerings. So that could be, for instance, a small organization that's actually like a ceramics place, but they put on this huge show, like music show, once a year, but they do it completely on commercial basis. Mm-hmm. You have a huge festival, the largest in the region, and they count, I think, 11,000 visitors. It's like a music festival, and they are also purely commercial. So that's sort of the second group, and then you have the third group, which is the homegrown or the civil society, non-commercial, non-organized, at least not in any legal sense. So that's the skateboard kids and the people who do street art and
the underground
Yeah, sort of the under the radar type thing, and some of it becomes recognizable, like the all the kids who do parkour, they sort of become organized on their own terms, and then suddenly they sort of become part of the public institutions that want to sustain what they're doing or help them, or also wanted to put it on their roster. So you have these three domains, like public culture, commercial culture, and civil society culture. Mm-hmm. And if you look at these as an integrated system, then what it is, it's all of a sudden like a highly differentiated cultural expression.
Yeah.
You have all kinds of ways of doing and enjoying and producing culture.
Well, I'm super curious about the state-funded culture and in the not state-funded culture, and I have specific experience of this myself in Odense, where I do work with some, you could call them underground genres of, say, techno, and then I've also looked for funding, so I've experience of it both with and without funding.
Yeah, and
then I have more experience with other projects, and I've been to many projects that have state funding, but I noticed that the entrance price for like student, target group audience, underground genres of music, they're the same. You know, so if you have state funding, the entrance price, it's still like less than 100 kroners. But with the state funding, they're able to pay the artists, so they don't really worry about their overheads. So along comes an independent organizer and wants to do something independently.
Yeah.
But in order just to cover the basics, that ticket price has to be 3 times as much.
Yeah.
And then the people, they're, why would I pay 3 times more than that? I can just go to this other event for 100 kroners. And I think it's my own personal opinion that it could be a very dangerous thing, actually, the state funding. And if I can add to that, I also have the experience of coming from Northern Ireland, and say, for example, punk and techno, they're huge genres in Belfast. You could call them, they're not really underground anymore, they're massive events. And they're the people want to go, and the audience, say the student age target group, that they're willing to pay the equivalent of 3-4 times the price of a pint locally to go there. Whereas over in Denmark, it's paying the price equivalent to 1 pint is a big ask, you know.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I have a specific question there, really, but are you looking into the effect of state-funded culture on non-state-funded culture?
In a sense, yeah. It's not one of the primary objectives, but it's definitely in there. And I think one of the things that struck me when I started looking into these things was that I needed to look into sort of the more historical background to get a sense of things. And that drew me on to, or made me look into basically the history of cultural policy in Denmark and in the northern countries in general, where the first minister of culture and the first cultural ministry was in the 60s, early 60s. And sort of just roughly sketching that history is that in the beginning you had an idea that culture was something that both expressed a people, but at the same time it was also something that should be for a people, both in terms of giving people access to fine arts and enable them to appreciate fine arts. And at the same time, you should also give people the opportunity to access more sort of popular arts. So the system of public support or state funding always pursued these differentiated paths. So you would support like the Royal Theatre or the ballet, for instance, but you would also develop what they called block grants, which was this sum of money that the state allocated to the regions or the counties and the municipalities for them to administer locally with an arm's length principle. So the state would give a bunch of money to for instance, ULSA that I'm looking at, and then it would be up to the local politicians to allocate the monies. Mm-hmm. So that became quite an interesting system of public support, because underlying that idea was that the idea was that local autonomy was cherished, based on the idea that people know best what they want and like locally.
That makes sense.
But yeah, it should still be a government priority to support both fine arts and crude arts, or whatever you want to call it, because they're all valuable in their own right. And I think one of the ideas was actually that you need to also, as a policy matter, to ensure that there's development in culture. So you want to support the avant-garde or the elite or the people who do experiments, and typically those are the people who can really live off it, because it never really becomes commercial. Mm-hmm. So you can make a living of it, but it still takes time and effort. So to have a vibrant cultural life, the idea was to support these people as well. And then with time, culture during the 70s becomes much more democratic. It became a priority to democratize cultural production and consumption. So you still had the arm's length principle, but at the same time, there was a demand for more participation. There was a demand for more, also more experimental stuff, but also as a counter movement to the experimental, you also saw like more conservative movements. And cultural policy couldn't really figure out what to do with that.
Conservative movements. Do you have an example of that?
Yeah, conservative movements. I mean, it comes in various shapes. Conservative movements could be, for instance, within theater. So you would have all these groups working on new theatrical forms, and both new theatrical formats, but also new ways of staging theater. And then at the same time, you would have like sort of old school theatrical performances in black boxes, and sticking with the tradition and sort of sticking with the old ways of doing theater. Mm. And I guess they would just sort of be not necessarily in conflict, but they would definitely be on different ends of the spectrum. And I think cultural policy was struggling with that, because on the one hand, you would need to have a way to support popular and I'd call it sort of the publical theatrical forms. Mm-hmm. That people enjoyed, and you draw a crowd, but at the same time, you would also want to support those people who did experiments.
Yeah, like if you had a symphony orchestra having a Beethoven recital, you could sell a lot of tickets for that of a certain demographic spectrum. Exactly. But culture moves with creativity and new things, yeah. But that they're also risky.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that happened in the 70s in terms of policy was also that you started developing these really complicated ideas of what good taste is. So you would also have people with an arts degree would start talking about what really good art is and what fine art is, and I could definitely trace in the present that some of the problems is drawing boundaries between professional arts and so-called amateur arts or folk arts. I can definitely see it within the crafts and within the visual arts, because that's particularly where people sell items. So they sell paintings, or they sell photography, or they sell ceramic works. And in that sphere, it's definitely a big issue to be able to tell the difference between what a proper artwork is and what's merely decoration, quote unquote. And I think that goes back to the 70s and 60s, where the whole idea of what is an artwork was really brought to the fore and was a really difficult question to answer. But you still needed that if you were supporting art, and then you needed to sort of draw a boundary. And I think it's still unresolved what it is.
It's still definitely up for debate. Yeah, like I think everybody can agree today that Banksy is art. If Banksy sprays paint on a wall, they take the wall away, and it's a
Yeah,
piece of art. But at the end of the day, that's graffiti. And graffiti's
yeah,
surely it's a spectrum
yeah.
from
It really is.
tagging a name to beautiful art that's done illegally on a wall. So
Yeah,
so it's very hard to be specific whenever you're talking about spectrums.
yeah, yeah. And then just in terms of the history of cultural policy, then when I guess when a lot of the neoliberal reforms and new government came in the 80s and onwards, there was a move within cultural policy to start thinking business strategy and art strategy together, to sort of say art and business can benefit from each other. So maybe we should start looking into ways in which business can support art, not just by buying art, but also by producing things collectively, or making art a priority in design, for instance, but also in terms of the rise of the experience economy. And so that whole idea of producing events that, I don't know, enhances the experience of shopping in the supermarket. I mean, all these ridiculous attempts, I mean, they come from there as well. So the late 80s and the 90s, that's when cultural policy started looking to business all of a sudden. And then at the turn of the century, all of a sudden there was this thing going on in the wake of September 11th, and the I guess also the financial crisis had something to do with it. But all of a sudden there was this move within cultural policy that culture is supposed to tell us who we are. So cultural policy is about sustaining the maintenance of cultural heritage and identity. So all of a sudden you would see a very conservative move in terms of looking to cultural heritage, but also defining what good art is by making these canons, they called them, sort of lists of good Danish art all of a sudden.
Okay.
That's really interesting. I mean, why would you want to do that? And I think a lot of it had to do with some idea of needing to identify what it meant to be Danish, which is kind of weird when you look at it, particularly from a country that has a long history of sort of mixed cultural backgrounds.
Indeed, and a lot of nationalism came after the recession. So whenever the economy crashes, then people are quite closed off, and they look inward instead of outward. So it's very interesting that this was actually reflected in the art policy.
Yeah, I mean, just one example which I think is really interesting is it's something that I just recently discovered, is that you know Dansk Folkeparti, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about them whenever you mentioned about them.
Yeah. They did some really interesting strategic moves when they were, I guess they were supporting the conservative government, and when it was the Social Democrats in government after the turn of the century, they had like a 15-year period where they actually managed to secure that. Just let me phrase it correctly.
I'll just remind the listeners that Dansk Folkeparti, I would describe them as a very nationalistic Danish party. They want to. They're in favor of closed borders and making it very difficult to emigrate to Denmark.
Yeah. What they did was they used cultural policy to secure that within the museum sector, they would increase the volume of funding for museums that maintain cultural heritage, which basically was their sort of discrete way of sustaining that the ethnic coherence of Danishness was kept intact. So answering what does it mean to be Danish by looking to the long stretch of cultural history, and what did people do back in the days, and what does it mean to be an agricultural society and have this language and these cultural forms of expression, and so on and so forth. And they totally use cultural policy to have like an ethnically pure agenda. And it's really discreet, and it doesn't really show unless you look into the numbers, where you can totally see how that party supported this line of policy.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, who would think that people were using museums to go for a nationalist agenda, but they did.
Wow. Via Denmark.
So yeah. So that, I mean, that's one of the things that I'm looking into in terms of state support for culture, and I think it plays many roles. It's definitely not just one thing. I think one of the things that surprised me the most when I looked into this history of cultural policy was that it had both quite distinct ideals about democratizing culture, making it inclusive. And you also have periods where it was all about national identity. And you also had periods where it was very, very much about Bildung, the German word Bildung. In Danish, it's dannelse.
I don't know this.
It's a really tricky word because I don't think you have it in English. I mean, it's a form of learning. It's like spiritual development. When you develop taste, you also develop your mental capabilities, and when you learn difficult things, you develop as a human being. And so sort of that notion of human development was sort of part of the idea of what culture was supposed to do to us, was to make us more enlightened and better people.
Well,
that's also part of it.
Well, that's a good goal to go for. And usually you go to a theater, you're moved, your soul is moved. You go to a museum, you learn something new, be it history or be it art that moves you. And I do apologize to any fans, but then there's a Rasmus Seebach concert. What do you get from that? Of course I joke, but so what about the most more recently? Then you mentioned everything up until just after the financial crisis. So is there a particular aspect of culture funding that you can see that has come about from the last social democratic government?
Well, this is when it gets really tricky, because one of the things that I've been trying to map, what I've been doing is that I've been mapping out the cultural organization. And by mapping, I'm quite literal in terms of first mapping where the organizations are. And then I've mapped how they are related to each other. So I've basically asked all the publicly funded and some of the commercial ones and the civic cultural forms. I've asked them, so who are you connected with and how, and what does this connection do for you as an organization, as a cultural producer? So I've mapped out that complex connectivity there is between the various cultural organizers. And I did that because I wanted to see if they were somehow affected by, I was looking at the structural reform in 2007, which it sounds kind of boring when you sort of present it like that, but it was a reform of the administrative system of Denmark that reduced the number of municipalities from 200 something to 98. So it's like a huge centralization movement. Yeah. And in the region I'm looking at, you had 3 municipalities that became 1. And that happened in 2007. So I was interested in seeing if the system of culture was affected by this reform somehow. Were they, as a total system, affected, or if affected at all, how? And I found out, or I think I can conclude that as a total system, you can't really tell if they were affected or responded in any ways.
Yeah.
As a whole coherent system. But if you look at the individual organizations, you have all these little points where people have become affected, or it had an effect on them. These neoliberal policies of centralization and sustaining a more smooth operation in terms of administration, it definitely had an effect on organizations in all kinds of ways. So I think that's really interesting because that's not about cultural policy. It's just about public administration, but it ends up affecting culture as well.
I'm trying to think if about where I'm from. I'm from a small country town in Northern Ireland called Portaferry, and there's nice little small town rivalries between our closest neighbours that are only
Hmm.
just a couple of kilometres up the road, and
Yeah.
then our other closest neighbours. So we have Portaferry, Gircubbin, and Ballygallagher, and there's rivalry in sport. There's rivalry in Friday night discos. So
Uh-huh.
I'm trying to imagine if suddenly those three places that see themselves as quite distinct, even though
Yeah.
there's only maybe 5 kilometers between them, if they were
Yeah.
suddenly forced to work together, uh, I imagine there would very easily be tensions that come from the history of
Yeah.
small town rivalry.
Yeah.
So I'm just
I mean,
imagining this happening where you
I
are.
can definitely recognize that.
Yeah.
It reminds me of one of my favorite sort of tales from the field. Um, I was looking into this small civic association that is called Dragsholm Lokalhistoriske Arkiv, um, which is a small association. Actually, it's quite big for the place. But anyways, it's an association that specializes in maintaining an archive of one of the former municipalities. It's the southernmost municipality of the three that were merged, and they meet once a week. They're retired folks. They meet at the library, and what they do is they sort through old documents. They put them in order, and they make an index. They take a huge stack of old photographies, and then they name each person on the photo because they know who people are. So they go through all this document material, and they sort of build a local memory.
Wow.
And they also, and every 10 years, they go to all the cemeteries in that region, and then they take pictures of all the tombstones, and then they update the list of who's buried where. So you can call from the US and be like, I'm looking for my family, and they will be like, yep, we know where he's buried. He's out there. And
Yeah.
they used to say that, or they told me in the interview that if you want to know what someone had done, you don't need to call the police. You can just ask us
Yeah.
because they know everything, right? But they said that during the reform, they were asked to merge with other local archives, and they were like, "Nope, we don't want to do that.
Yeah.
We're strictly local, and that's where we belong, and we don't mind the other ones, but we definitely don't want to deal with it."
Yeah.
So I think you can definitely recognize, and there are other examples of this sort of small place against another small place. This it's definitely
That
there.
makes sense.
But the interesting thing is when you look to the level of the public organizations, they're totally past that. They don't have any fidelity to all the regional borders. They're like a regional, entirely regional organization. So the theater, it's like for the entire region and so on and so forth. But obviously the old borders, the old territories are all over the place
Yeah.
still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely recognize that from where I'm from. So I'm also curious then about the economy for those institutions that are funded from the state.
Yeah.
Is the state looking at, because the state gives a lot of money to a theatre, for example. It goes into paying artists or just the running of the theatre, and then that money will be spent. Taxes will come back around. Are they looking into this circularity of the economy whenever they're giving funding?
I think it's I don't know for sure. I mean, I think the idea of circularity is there somehow. Like you described, it's like a whole system of economic circulation. Um, I think at some point they were also just supporting culture because they thought that it was a good thing in itself. that it was building civil society, and that was good. So I guess it's definitely a question of who's in power. I mean, who's in political power in terms of what kind of ideological thinking they subscribe to. But definitely, I mean, in Denmark, I was just today looking into the laws that are regulating what's called a regional theater. So if you are a regional theater, you have to live up to a set of criteria, and one of them is that you need to be locally embedded, and you also need to do 2 novel theatrical productions per year, and then you get a state support, which is kind of tricky, but it's worth sort of fleshing out how it works. So the municipality will pay, for instance, 4 million Danish kroner to a regional theater, and then the state will reimburse the municipality 50% of that grant to the theater. So the municipality will be paying out of its own pocket, so to speak, and then the state will reimburse them. So I'm like, why is this system even in place? I mean, why is this working this way?
It sounds complicated.
Yeah, it sounds complicated, but also just like, why would you want to support culture in this way? I mean, why would you even want to set up an entire system for supporting culture? Why don't you just let people run it on their own? And I think one of the main reasons is actually a deep concern with what happens to people if there is no cultural infrastructure, if there is no cultural system, both in terms of the cultural identity, the regional identity, but also this idea that it's good for us to be surrounded by beautiful things or exciting things, that culture is basically just good for us as people. So, and I'm constantly looking for these sort of hidden motives.
Yeah.
Because the skepticism is like, but
what are they up
the
to?
more, yeah, what are they up to? But the more I look into it, the more I'm like, God damn it. I mean, it actually seems quite genuine at some points that people honestly believe that it will make a better society if we support culture. Not just to differentiate us from all the rest, but also because it somehow works to make people better. I think that's quite an exciting idea, actually.
It sure is, yeah.
And I mean, also coming for me, I totally identify as an anarchist. So I'm like, I should be really, mad at this system and be like, just burn everything down. And I'm like, so it's sort of the point where data is like looking you deep into your eyes and be like, you got to reconsider some of your priorities, mate.
Well, this is the thing. If the funding wasn't there, there would be people that would just be pushing to create things instead, and because of how much say a symphony orchestra costs, the people that are pushing those unfunded things would be more underground, I would imagine. But it also brings me to what is the measure of success with regards a piece of culture? Because I've been to a symphony with a few hundred people who've enjoyed the evening, clapped accordingly. But then I've been to an event where there's maybe 30 people, and a couple of them are so moved by a piece of music that the tears are tripping down their faces,
Yeah.
So I would say one of those bits of culture has moved somebody to the point where their life could be changed, and they would go through an unforgettable experience.
Yeah.
Where the other just might go back to the symphony next month. So it's very difficult to measure the impact of culture on a person, because it's very subjective what they're into, and then what they get out of it.
Totally. I mean, I don't think you can measure it.
Yeah.
I think it's unmeasurable. But I definitely think that culture makes a huge difference. I mean, just imagine if you took it away.
We're here. We're here right now. We're in it.
Yeah.
And it's it's really difficult, actually. I've enjoyed go onto YouTube to experience some concerts or Facebook Live concerts or theater on YouTube. But I think a lot of people are really feel that they're missing a huge part of enjoyment from life by not being able to go out and experience their chosen form of culture.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me quite a lot, and this also connects with I guess a more methodological question about how much of our knowledge and our experience is embodied, basically. That a lot of the artistic experiences or the aesthetic experiences that we have are embodied. So imagine that we can sort of replace those experiences by looking at a screen is almost like ridiculous, because sure, you can read a book and you can also watch a film on your screen, and you will still have that embodied experience. But live music, the performative arts, looking at visual art, there are so many forms of aesthetic experience that are embodied. And I think what a lot of people are experiencing is that the body is totally out of the picture now in terms of experiencing these things. And I think that's a form of privation. I mean, you definitely have a sense that something is missing here. Yep. So for me, that's also a really good indicator of the need for aesthetic spaces that our societies also need. They need spaces that are devoted to aesthetics, because apparently it's something that we appreciate, even if we can't agree on what kind of aesthetics are nice and what aren't, and taste also becomes critical in this sense. But still, like, just the basic idea that you should have aesthetic spaces as an infrastructure that's just as important as a highway.
10,000 years ago, we're living in caves. We still painted them.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
It couldn't be good for your current PhD whenever all cultures close down for the foreseeable future.
No, it wouldn't be good.
No. That must be quite difficult to deal with.
Yeah. I mean, personally, luckily I had all my field data.
Okay. So now it's just just the writing.
Yeah, it's just wrapping up and writing the final ones. But I mean, I have colleagues who were in the middle of doing their field work, and people who were prevented from interviewing or doing all kinds of observation data, and that's really hard. So there's definitely science that's completely prevented from doing what it's doing. So yeah, this is a really tricky.
It's a tricky one indeed.
Yeah.
Thomas, so you're busy with a PhD. You're busy with the release of your new punk album. There you go. But I noticed whenever I was stalking you earlier on that you were part of something that sounds brilliant, and it was called Ooops Festival.
Yeah.
A festival of mistakes.
Yes.
That sounds fantastic. Tell us about that, please.
Sure. I mean, Oops, the festival for failure and fuck-ups was it was basically what the name sounds like. It was a festival that was cross aesthetic. So we had theater and music and cooking and lectures and film. And what we wanted to do was to create a festival space that, I guess, celebrated failure as both a human condition, but also looked into various kinds of failures and explore what it means to fail. And we had all kinds of experiences. And one thing that runs through it as a red thread is that it's easy to celebrate the idea that we need to fail fast and fail often to develop, but to own your own failures is really hard. So we had this really interesting tension between the pain of failing and the idea that failing is good. So that's one tension that we explored. And Another one is that failure is fun. Because I mean, there's so many hilarious stories about people failing in all kinds of ways, and sometimes when people die, it's even fun. I mean, if it's a scientist who dies from an experiment, it's fun. I mean, it sounds hard, but there are so many ways in which you laugh at failure, even if it's also like terrible.
Yeah.
So
well,
that's the second part.
Yeah, like I'm thinking about famous examples from science would be the discovery of penicillin.
Yeah, that's a classic.
Alexander Fleming just was a very unclean and unkept gentleman.
Yeah.
He noticed some fungi growing, and yeah. Was it the penicillin prevented growth around the spores? I think it was something like that. And then we have penicillin. So that's
But also, imagine like how bitter it must be to be the person who turned away J.K. Rowling.
Oh yeah.
I mean, and there was a few who did that. I mean, and so you have all these famous instances of people like fucking up like immensely in terms of recognizing something that they should appreciate it but didn't, or didn't understand or something. So there's so many ways in which failure works. For instance, one thing that touched me quite a lot this year, when we did the festival, it was 2 years ago. We had a soldier who was wounded in Afghanistan, and just at the start of his tour, and his story was a story of having to recover and figure out how to live with the wounds that he had. So that was a story about a body that was basically failing him in terms of what he expected it to be able to perform. And so that wasn't one of the fun parts. It was more like moving, but I think that really fleshed out that failure often also has to do with expectations. Mm-hmm. But failure also often teaches us something about not just our own expectations, but also it broadens our idea of what we can do. So I think the field of failure, if you look at failure, you also need to look at what is called post-trauma growth. Is that when people have lived through really harsh things or traumatic experiences, they actually sometimes end up having better lives.
I'm thinking about a good example that also has to do with body mutilation. I'm thinking about the guitarist Tony Lumi of Black Sabbath. He got his finger cut off in a factory and invented the power chord that went on to create heavy metal music and punk music. You know, yeah. So if it wasn't for that mistake, that horrible thing that happened to him, these creative industries wouldn't it would have came around a different way. But that's a fun story, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a discharge, or at least it's one of these Midlands punk bands from the 80s who developed sort of the D beat, basically because they couldn't play the drums fast enough. So the way in which they played fast became a style of its own.
Yeah,
I like that. Shortcomings become style expressions. I think that's pretty cool.
Brilliant. It happens so much in music, you know. I think the field drum machine, Roland 808 from Japan, that was meant to be used to substitute for drummers in funk recordings, was then picked up by some poor kids on the streets of Chicago and turned into techno.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. I think, and you have that story all the time. And within the sort of the framework of what we're talking about and the research I'm doing, I can definitely tell that it's happening all the time, that fuck ups and mistakes and things that didn't really turn out the way they were supposed to, they bring new things.
Well, so I think there's an inherent problem, though, in science. I was studying biology, you know, and you set out with a hypothesis. You know, I think this has a role in that, and it comes back, the results come back, and there's no effect.
Yeah.
That's not published. The no effect is not published. Only the things that are interesting, things that we found the reason that this has this effect. They're published, but all of these other experiments go unpublished. But that's still science. That's still information that somebody further on down the road could use, so that they don't repeat those same mistakes.
Yeah.
So there's a huge problem, I think, in the world of science to not get these things published.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that we don't publish negative results.
Exactly. It's horrible.
There's, I can't remember her name, but there's a professor somewhere who she made her CV publicly available, and she made her CV one of failure. So it's like a CV of her professional failures, all the research that went wrong and all the things that messed up. And I think that's a really interesting story in terms of looking at a professor who's obviously achieved, and then sort of review how much fucking up she had to go through in order to get where she was at. Because if you only estimate the career of a professor by looking at what they managed to publish, it doesn't really tell the whole story of all the stuff they had to endure that was basically just uncertainty and fucking up. So I completely agree that it's a huge problem. And one of the problems is that, I don't know how it is in your end of the world, but here we definitely have this word excellence in research. What does that mean? I mean, it could mean flawlessness, right? It can easily be interpreted as just getting it right every time. But it could also mean that excellence is the ability to use all your failures creatively and to learn from them. So you can start to look at excellence as a contested topic. I mean, what does it mean to be excellent? I would say that it means fucking up a lot.
I think it's very, very suspicious in the world of science if you hear the word flawless or excellence. Yeah. You know, it's like, I don't know really. Where did show me all your other show me your raw data.
Yeah. And also it's like I think that's why scientists can sometimes be really difficult to interview if it's for like short radio, what do you call it, radio spots, or like short 2-minute interviews. And so, because most scientists are like, yeah, but no, I'm not entirely sure. And I mean, there are uncertainties, and you also have, there's all these caveats that you need to make. And all the while they're being asked to be really specific and say something that is a truth with some kind of explanatory power. So you have this tension about what's expected of a scientist, and the world of science is much more like processual, and you can't really say much for sure. And
yeah,
so that's definitely a tension.
Indeed. So it takes people like you to embrace failures and make a festival out of it. So more of that, and then perhaps mistakes will be more embraced by the wider culture.
That'd be fine.
Thomas, it's been wonderful chatting to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining me for Friday afternoon beer.
That's cool.
I'm looking forward to getting back to Denmark, and looking forward to seeing Tvivler on the road promoting their new album Ego. So
yeah, cool.
Cheers again.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.